Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Pekhom Basu and I am a guest faculty with Tata Institute of Social Sciences. Today I will be talking about Indian ideologies in the ancient period, Vedic religions, Jainism and Buddhism. The objectives for the learner, one is to familiarize with ancient India, to understand what Vedic religion is all about, and to comprehend the emergence of Jainism and Buddhism. History is essentially the presentation in chronological order of successive changes in the means and relations of production. D.D. Kosambi, a noted scholar on ancient India, has mentioned this. And this is important because often what we understand and what we read is historiography. It's the interpretation of individual historians on the time and events of a particular period. For ancient India, in addition, we do have archaeological evidences and therefore the evidence of many cultures that were present, which Dandekar writes about, the light in the variety of cultures that we see, the pre-Harappan, Harappan, post-Harappan, which is essentially the Indus Valley civilization. Thereafter, the Banas culture, the Chalcolithic cultures of Narmada and central India, the ochre color pottery culture of the upper Ganga Valley, the copper hoard culture and the painted grey ware culture, and as well as the northern black polished ware culture. Vedic religion is attributed to the Aryans who came to India just after the Indus Valley civilization. There is a lot of debate on whether they were conquerors or settlers, but we will not go into the debate for this particular module. Vedic religion is understood from Vedic literature or the Vedas compiled over the years, an oral tradition that was handed down from one generation to the next, which means that Vedic literature is not written. It is completely oral. It was written down much later, much after the Vedic period. It consists of the Samhitas, the Brahmanas, the Upanishads and the four Vedas, which we are more familiar with, Rig Veda, Yajurveda, Samaveda and Atharva Veda. The Vedic period is divided into two periods, the early Vedic period, which is from 1500 to 1000 BC, and the later Vedic period, 1000 to 600 BC. The significance of this early Vedic period is that nature worship was dominant in the early Vedic period. There was no caste or class differentiation as we understood today, because that began to develop only in the later Vedic period. And there was what existed at caste in the early Vedic period was based on profession, which meant that there was mobility. So for example, if one was born as a son of a Brahmin, one could, and if one was interested in, for example, carpentry, one could actually learn the trade of a carpenter and become a carpenter. Similarly, somebody who was born in a family who was engaged in leather work, if he was interested in studies, he or she could study and become a priest. Also, the reason I say he or she is because in the early Vedic period, there was no discrimination in gender as well. So no caste and no gender discrimination in the early Vedic period. Later Vedic period shows a considerable advance in material culture and a geographical shift to the Ganga Valley. The most significant development was the consolidation of the Varna or the caste system, leading to its rigidity and emergence of the Brahmins as a dominant caste group. The Vedic poet priests also undertook to collect together all the scattered old and new mantras. They grouped them into suktas or hymns, the Rig Veda Samhita or the collection of the suktas relating to the religion of the classes, and the Atharva Veda Samhita, which is essentially the religion of the masses for the sake of convenience. So here itself we see a clear division for the people, which is also reflective of what the division we see in terms of the caste system. Now, where does Vedic religion, over the years, Vedic religion evolved into what we know today as classical Hinduism, but Vedic religion as we understand in the ancient period is different from classical Hinduism in a number of respects. One, Vishnu was relatively unimportant. Second, the cult of images and temple worship do not appear in Veda. This is a later addition. Moreover, there was also a foreshadowing of later Bhakti religion. The division into varnas or classes was present, but not fully fledged caste system of later Hinduism. Only in Upanishads is there the almost and all-pervasive belief of Hinduism in rebirth, and the center of religion is still the sacrificial cultus. Sacrifice was given a lot of importance in later Vedic period. Vedic religion set certain patterns that have maintained themselves. One, the dominance of Brahmin class was well established by the mid-Vedic times, consolidated during the later Vedic period, and exists as we see even today. Upper class patterns of initiation and domestic ritual have continued with relatively little change, considering the time span that has been involved. And of course, Upanishads have retained dominant positions scripturally. Now, between the Vedic period and Jainism and Buddhism, certain social and economic changes were taking place, which I would say actually paved the way for the rise of Jainism and Buddhism in India. So what we see here is that in the later Vedic period, which is, I will also synonymously call it Hindu religion at this point, the values stressed were not conducive for an expanding national economy. Hindu religion had gone through a phase of extreme orthodoxy and caste-based discrimination. It was a religion which was perhaps conducive for a community which was engaged in agriculture, a community that was settled in one place, but the religion was not conducive for a community that would go into trading and trade with the outside world especially. This is where, as I said earlier, that the economy was growing. People were from the later Vedic period was engaged in trade with people from across the rivers. There were the river valley civilizations, so we did have trade relations as far as Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, and on the other hand, we were also doing trade within the country. Also at this point, I would like to remind that India was not a country as we understand it today at that time. It was essentially small principalities, small kingdoms. And we were engaged in trading with all of these kingdoms, and we were trading across caste groups, which people found difficult to continue under the orthodoxy of the later Vedic period. Jainism comes in at this opportune moment in the 5th century BC. It shares its belief with Hinduism in terms of rebirth, but it opposed caste system. It did not recognize the predominance of a caste in the religion. The name Jainism itself is derived from the word Jina, which means conqueror. And they have attained liberation from the cycle of birth and death and are in that sense conquerors of their own life cycles of birth, of death and birth. Often we attribute Jainism to Mahavira and we see him as the founder, but in reality he was actually the last of the Tirthankaras. There were 24 Tirthankaras who came in before him, and he was the last, but he essentially consolidated the learning, the teachings of Jainism and put it all together. Jains, as we all know, believe in ahimsa or non-violence, a commitment which binds the Jain to harm no living being, neither man nor animal nor plant. They realized the importance of the environment and made attempts to conserve it, even going beyond the food chain concept and believing in staunch vegetarianism. Gandhi was attracted to Jainism in many ways, to the personal sanctity of Jain leaders, to the compassion of the Jains in their many works of social welfare, and to the secularism and relativism of Jain metaphysics. To sum up, the essence of Jainism is concern for the welfare of every being in the universe and for the health of the universe itself. The three guiding principles are right belief, right knowledge, and right conduct. So Jains are divided into two major sects, the Digambaras and the Shvetambaras. And these two sects even today continue to be different. Shvetambaras, of course, we often see them. They are the ones who, in the cities, we often find them going around for alms. I wouldn't say begging. because that's not the word that is used with the Jain monks. Jainism, unlike Vedic religion, did not again discriminate in among genders. So you do have a lot of, you do find many nuns as well as monks, which in later Vedic period you would not come across. Jainism is also a religion of self-help. There are no gods or spiritual beings that will help human beings. They have no priests. Because remember, they were trying to break away from the orthodoxy of the Vedic religion. So all that the Vedic religion stood for, elaborate rituals, the dominance of the priests or the Brahmins, the dominance of the caste system, and in terms of the coterie that it was trying to create by keeping a whole lot of people outside, which meant that for example, in the later Vedic period, the religious texts were not available to the common man. They were all written in Sanskrit, and only those within the upper castes had the privilege to study them. So which is why Jainism taught in the language of the common people, which is Prakrit. As opposed to Sanskrit in Hinduism, in classical Hinduism. And Jainism allowed both monks and nuns to be in their order, and both of them followed the Digambara and the Shvetambara sects. Jainism did not, it's not that Jainism gave away, cleared the path for Buddhism to come in. Jainism and Buddhism were religion that were almost, they coexisted with each other. Buddhism comes in at a slight later date, and Jainism precedes Buddhism in that sense. Buddhism again preaches to reach a state of nirvana. There is no belief in a personal God. The path of enlightenment is through the practice and development of morality, meditation and wisdom. Existence is endless because individuals are reincarnated over and over again, experiencing suffering throughout many lives. And the whole practice of meditation, morality, this is something which you will even see in present times. A lot of self-help, self-healing emphasizes on this aspect of meditation, which is why Buddhism has somehow continued to be popular and lived on, and a lot of people practice it, even if they are some of the tenets of Buddhism, especially meditation, is practiced even by non-Buddhists today. The history of Buddhism is associated with this persona of Siddhartha Gautam's spiritual journey to enlightenment, and the teachings and ways of living that developed from his enlightenment. There are different schools or sects of Buddhism that have developed hence. There is Theravada Buddhism, which is most popular in Sri Lanka, Cambodia, Thailand, Laos and Burma. And Mahayana Buddhism, which is strongest in Tibet, China, Taiwan, Japan, Korea and Mongolia. However, in spite of having the commonality of a religion, you still see that there are problems between, for example, Tibet and China. There are problems between Japan and China. So history somehow in this case shows that religion does not necessarily bind nations. Even if you share the same religion, you can still be at loggerheads with each other. Buddhism enjoyed royal patronage. King Ashoka was the biggest champion of Buddhism, so to say, and his edicts, which were later on discovered, those ruins actually gave us a lot of insight into the teachings of the Buddha. Buddhism disappeared from India during the 13th century as Hinduism and Islam became the dominant religions and philosophies. This was also the time, there are debates on why Buddhism disappeared or why even Jainism not really disappeared. I would say both Buddhism and Jainism, the popularity diminished. One of the reasons that is attributed to these is that they were both preached non-violence or ahimsa, and they could not keep up with the marauding conquerors who were coming into the country, and which is why they paved the way for dominant Hinduism and Islam around the 13th century. However, religion does not, they live through people and they continue even today, as we know. And Buddhism is still prevalent as much in this country as it was then. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, the father of the Constitution, used Buddhism as a tool of social action when he publicly adopted Buddhism at a Diksha ceremony in Nagpur shortly before his death. It's ironical that history repeated itself, because to defy caste discrimination of later Vedic period, Buddhism had emerged. And Ambedkar had to again use Buddhism to empower the so-called untouchables among the Hindus. A lot of people see this as a political stance. There's a lot of debate on this as well. But I would personally feel that it was merely a way out of the staunch caste system that has existed in this country over the years. Nothing has been able to break down the untouchability or the rigidity of the caste system, which is why Dr. Ambedkar was attempting to break it through by the adoption of Buddhism once again. Religion, as we see, have an overarching influence on society, on art and culture, and of course on politics. Ancient India, as we see, gave birth to 3 new religions, and these religions developed into institutions and still survive today. In fact, Buddhism is now almost a global religion. But as Gandhi said, God has no religion. But however, we have managed to create these religions and also create divide among ourselves, among the people. And as we move on to the next modules, where we will talk about medieval India, we will see that how religion has further developed, and what in ancient period we saw the new religions coming up. Even in the medieval period, we see further development of new religion, which didn't really turn into religion, but they were movements. But all these religions, the 2 new religions here, in terms of Jainism and Buddhism, were a reaction to the orthodoxy of the Vedic period. They were more in terms of social reforms through a spiritual connection. Early Vedic period laid emphasis on worship of nature. So the various forces of nature, for example, Indra, the god of thunder, had a position, had a commanding position in the pantheon of gods. Then you had the sun god, you had the water god Varuna. Each one of them was worshipped and was important to the early Vedic period worshippers, which is why it is often said that they were nature worshippers. But if you think of it in today's term, in the context of society today, that would be a very beautiful way of preserving nature, where you respect what is there in nature, and all your since it is your religion, you take care of it and you don't destroy nature. So environmentalism actually begins then, in the early Vedic period. Gradually, from the early Vedic period, when we move on to the later Vedic period, we see the dominance of rituals, and the dominance of sacrifice, which is when we see that for every ceremony, birth, death, there was an elaborate ritual where you needed the priest to preside over every aspect, and it also became expensive. So religion became expensive, religion became ritualistic, And that is when gradually you also see the emergence of the dominance of the caste system. As I explained earlier, in the early Vedic period, caste was based on profession, which means whatever you were, the occupation that you were engaged in, out of your own volition, was thought to be your caste. So if you did enjoy reading, writing, you would become a priest. But if even if you were a priest, if you were born in a priest's family but did not enjoy, but enjoyed something else, then you would move on to that profession. But in the later Vedic period, and this was where so those who were in the later Vedic period, this system of caste was consolidated, and it then became rigid. So, for example, those who were engaged in priesthood were the Brahmins, the twice born, the ruling class or the kings were the Kshatriyas, the warrior caste, and then you had the business community, the Vaishyas, and then the Shudras. But even in the later Vedic period, Shudras were anybody from any other profession, so artisans, carpenters, farmers, everybody were clubbed in that particular caste. It was not the way we understand it in the later Hinduism period. But yes, untouchability was already beginning to develop in the later Vedic period, and which is why, as a reaction to that, you see the emergence of Jainism and Buddhism. The e-text elaborates on each of these slides, and they also have a long reading list. That is important because it is absolutely impossible to club everything, especially hundreds of years of ancient India, into a packet. So please read those books and be mindful of whom you are reading, because each historian, as I said, interprets history in his or her own way. They come from their own political viewpoint. So it is important to read a variety of scholars, right from British historians to Indian historians who have documented the period and have commented on the social, economic and political scenario of the times. Thank you very much.